I hope you're getting up there.
It's very nice to see so many people here. My name is Philip Hardy and I'm a fellow in classics here. William George Clark, 1821 to 1878, was senior fellow and vice master at Trinity College. In an age before narrow specialization, Clark founded the Journal of Philology, the Journal for Classical Philology, and was also co-founder of the Cambridge Shakespeare, a collation of early editions with a selection of emendations. And from this endeavour emerged a single-volume Globe edition of Shakespeare, which was for many years the standard edition worldwide. Clark died in 1878 at a relatively young age before bringing to completion an edition of Aristophanes, on which he had laboured for many years. Clark left property to Trinity College, from which an annual lectureship in English literature, the term these days being broadly understood, was founded and named after him. Most of my information about Clark comes from the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography article by Leslie Stephen, who also gave the first Clark lectures in 1888 on the modest topic of English literature. Since then, we have hosted many leading scholars, critics, writers and thinkers. And past Clark lecturers have included T.S. Eliot, Ian Forster, C.S. Lewis, F.R. Leaders, Richard Rorty, Toni Morrison, Bernard Williams, Rowan Williams, Helen Bendler, Anne Barton, Seamus Heaney, Quentin Skinner, Mary Carruthers, Alice Oswald, and Simon Armitage. H.A.J. Munro, the great 19th century editor of Lucretius and fellow of Trinity, said in a brief memoir of Clark in the Journal of Philology that he had, quote, the most accomplished and versatile mind I ever encountered. This year's Clark lecturer is also distinguished by his versatility and by his combination of scholarship on both classical and Renaissance literature. Gordon Braden, Professor Emeritus at the University of Virginia, is well known as a scholar and critic, in particular of English Renaissance literature. He took his first degree at Rice University, Texas, with which, coincidentally, Trinity has for some years had a happy exchange agreement. And he then moved to the University of Texas at Austin as a graduate student, and then on to Yale for his PhD. In 1975, he went to the University of Virginia, where I believe he has been ever since, retiring in 2014 as the Lyndon Kent Memorial Professor of English. Professor Braden's work has always had a strong focus on the role of classical literature in the making of English poetry and drama. His 1985 Renaissance tragedy and the Seneca tradition was important not just to students of Renaissance literature, but helped classicists to a more sympathetic view of the Senecan tragedy than was then usual. He's written two important books on Petrarch and Petrarchism, Petrarchan Love and the Continental Renaissance of 1999, and just a couple of years ago, Petrarchan Love and the English Renaissance. He's also interested in the history of translation from the classics and co-edited the Oxford History of Literary Translation in English, 1550 to 1660. He's also tried his own hand at literary translation, taking on a book of and writing the introduction for the recent multi-hand translation of the late antique Greek 48-book epic extravaganza on the life of the god Dionysus, known as his Dionysiaca. Today, Professor Braden turns from one of the latest productions of ancient Greek literature to one of his earliest poets, Sappho, in his Clark lectures on Sappho, A New Look Back. And it is with pleasure that I invite him to give his first Clark lecture on the Violet Hour.
Okay, thank you, Philip, very much. Am my mic right? Can I be heard? Okay, good. I'm grateful and greatly flattered to have been invited to deliver these lectures, and particularly grateful because the need to come up with a topic, quote, something to do with English literature more or less is how I remember the invitation, has roused me to revisit what has come to feel like unfinished business on my part. Something like 60 years ago, when I still imagined that my goal was to become some kind of scientist, probably either a mathematician or an astrophysicist, I nevertheless signed up for an unofficial after-hours course in classical Greek, taught by my charismatic high school Latin teacher, who was all of twice my age and, yes, female. I don't remember much about the class, but it ran long enough for me to register that classical Greek was much more challenging and much more interesting than classical Latin, and also for me to experience what it has taken me much longer to experience with any Latin poem, the ability to take in the original text in the way I would, if I were up for it, take in an English poem. That is to say, the ability to take in, getting to the aesthetic payoff without too much of a stumble through the rock-strewn detour of an unvoiced English translation. But the payoff was swift and stunning, unlike that of any English poem I knew at the time. The text in question now goes under the bewitching title of Sappho Fragment 168b. You'll be hearing more about it in due course. My enthusiasm felt faded when I was able to get my hands on Willis Barnstone's bilingual paperback edition, Greek and English on facing pages, of what were then her literary remains, 158 numbered fragments. I still have it in pretty good condition, with some discoloration on the spine. To give you some idea of how many years that's been, the still legible price on the cover is $1.25. It is still in print from a different publisher for $18.95, a markup of over 1,500%. I didn't become a scientist and have never seriously regretted it. I have at times regretted events and choices that led to my spending most of my professional life within the walls of an English department, though doing so has made some things easier. The English departments in question at Yale and the University of Virginia were generously supportive of my interest in the much-studied commerce between early modern European literature and its classical antecedents, yet in practical terms, a really satisfactory engagement with those antecedents is possible only if you can spend almost all of your available energy on it over an extended period of time. So it is with what I'm not absurdly exaggerating to call my first literary love in a foreign tongue. Sappho worked in an eccentric and spottily documented dialect of classical Greek, it's now called Eastern Aeolic, whose rules we are still figuring out. Classical Latin, remember, seemingly had no dialects. And her poems have survived in a spectacularly tattered and dispersed form that has nourished an immense, ever-growing, and despite the ostentatious self-assurance shown by many of those involved, maddeningly tentative body of scholarship and commentary in numerous languages. The last few decades have added a distracting legal and ethical controversy, as far as I know still unresolved, involving the provenance and indeed current location of some recent papyrological discoveries whose content had already been made public. None of this is easily sorted through, and I wish I'd been in a position to do a more thorough job of keeping up along the way. Over the last year or so, however, I've taken the occasion to look back at the object of my still unregretted teenage infatuation, in light both of what has happened in the study of Sappho since then. The item count in Camillo Neri's 2021 edition is 309, just shy of being twice Barnstone's, though for various reasons that does not correspond exactly to the current number of fragments, and of my own developing fascination with the complicated vicissitudes of the classical tradition in its interactions with later cultures. The results I have to offer here are diverse and eclectic, with no specific methodological or ideological agenda, or even much of an embracing thesis. I will be coming down eventually where I always like to end up, at the reading of particular poems, 3 of them in particular in my last lecture. It is my own conviction, and these days not an especially lonely one, that the study of a text, classical and otherwise, and the study of its reception by both readers and other writers are quite properly inseparable activities. The twinned attention they call for is a uniquely valuable and illuminating way of perceiving the distinct quidditas of each. Sappho, however, makes a very special case for a reason I've already cited. In all but a handful of instances, maybe 1, possibly 2, 3, or 4 at a stretch, what we are starting with are not complete poems, but parts of poems, fragments of poems, shreds even, culled in chaotically various ways out of what was once a substantial corpus that had been assembled and tidied up at the Library of Alexandria several centuries after Sappho's death. No copy of any such collection, no section of it even, has survived intact. In some cases, a later classical author with whom time has dealt more gently has quoted a line or two, or a couple of words, to illustrate some point about meter or grammar, or, in fewer instances than we might have hoped, to celebrate some moment of brilliant poetry. An almost complete poem of Sappho's, and personally I think it is complete, and I'll be coming to that, is quoted in the work that introduces the category of the sublime, hoopsas, into European literary criticism. It will be the focus of my second lecture. In most other cases, we have lines, parts of lines, parts of words, a letter or two here or there, that by sheer chance have become because of the desiccated climatic conditions in the Egyptian desert, where these scraps ended up, survive the shredding of some copy of the collected Sappho to make packing material or whatever. Sappho is hardly the only classical author to suffer such a fate. With the exception of Pindar, all of the classic Greek melic poets, which is lyric poets in the strictest sense of the term, have come to a similar end, at best a minuscule gathering of possibly complete poems, accompanied by a pile of fragments and a name and some varyingly dubious legends. What is unique about Sappho in this connection, astonishing if you think about it, is the durability and immensity of the ongoing reputation somehow grounded in such scanty textual debris. You never really know where evidence of that reputation might turn up. Last year, on the American TV show Jeopardy, yes, I was watching it, it comes on between the local news and primetime, contestants were asked to name the author of a recently discovered fragment of a poem about Tithonus. That would be Sappho fragment 5.8c. And they were, no kidding, right there with the answer. I was watching it happen. In 2000, a dream sequence in the last episode of the 4th season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, then at the height of its richly deserved popularity, had one of the ongoing characters body painting her lesbian lover, among the first such couples on an American TV series, with the Greek text on American TV of Sappho Fragment 1. It is not identified or translated in the episode. That is left up to the viewer, who can quickly be brought up to speed by IMDb. Anacreon and Alcaeus can eat their hearts out. The legend of Sappho, of course, has taken on a life of its own, often independent of what survives in her poetry. But it is the relation between those disiecta membra and her literary afterlife that most attracts my interest. That interest extends across the whole course of that afterlife, though for professional reasons, I have a particular interest in the 16th century, a chapter that has generally been scanted in the substantial body of scholarship and criticism that her case has attracted. I will, in my third lecture, be giving attention to the way Sappho's literary remains were presented in the two collections that established what there was of a canon of her work for modern readers before fresh sources started turning up in the desert. I will also present my own version of how that canon comes across in a collective way as a body of work and as a fragmented but still powerful statement about desire and its fortunes. But I will be keeping the later discoveries in mind all along, and in my last lecture I will abandon any limitation to the early modern period and be moving on to some of those newer editions, though not, as it happens, the very newest, about which I think I have something to say. Literary criticism is, of course, much more comfortable with complete texts. There is an all but irresistible impulse somehow to fill in the gaps, and every editor of Sappho has done some of that. Indeed, without emendation and supplementation, much of what comes down to us with Sappho's name attached is almost unreadable. A lot of the repair work has become widely enough accepted to pass for textus receptus. In most cases, I'm happy to go along with the common wisdom when it exists, though anyone venturing to talk about Sappho's poetry needs to remain alert to what readings are still subject to dispute should anyone decide to relitigate some particular question. And, how shall I put this, the Lord will always provide such a person. Among the readings in dispute is the first word of the first poem, so that when I refer to it by its incipit as poikilothron, rather than poikilothron, you got that? Which means something different. Or a couple of other alternatives, I'm making a choice, though in this case, the conventional one. The Greek text you'll occasionally see up on the screen, and I warn you, this is my first experience of PowerPoint, but bear with me. The Greek text you'll occasionally be seeing up on the screen will, for simplicity's sake, be mostly shorn of the editorial signals which accompany it in a properly critical edition to identify tentative and contested readings, but one should always remember that they are there and be willing to engage with them, and I hope you can be patient when I do so. And of course, local repairs are hard to separate from larger reconstructions of the general context within which we imagine these fragmentary poems taking place. This indeed is where the most fervent debates about Sappho have been staged. Some of those debates have effectively and happily kind of gone away. And a number of the more familiar topics in discussion of Sappho will have only a vestigial presence in what I have to say. I take it, I certainly hope, that there are now few people fretting over whether or not Sappho gives voice to intentional and uninhibited, and insofar as we're getting biographical, sincere expressions of female homoerotic desire. She does. The textual indications that she does so are clear enough, and clear-headed scholars from the late 15th century onward, beginning with no less a figure than Angelo Poliziano, are on record acknowledging as much, even when some of them make a point of disapproving. That still leaves considerable room for debate, however, about the environment in which such desire was experienced and understood, and most importantly, from our point of view, became the subject of song. Almost the only contemporary evidence we have in that regard for Lesbos in the 7th century BC, and indeed for at least another 2 centuries after Sappho's lifetime, is whatever we can extract or can convince ourselves that we can extract from what's left of her poetry. As a professional literature person, I'm probably more comfortable than some others are with having our main resource here be our own imagination at work on this archive, though we do need to watch our step. We need to play an appropriate skepticism about merely finding what we set out looking for, and in the present moment, Sappho's case comes with especially strong temptations in this regard. Play it off against an open-mindedness as to what those possibilities might actually be. I think it is our loss that Eileen Mary Challens, aka Mary Renault, the 20th century's best informed writer of historical fiction about ancient Greece, herself an unconflicted lesbian who, before turning to classical Greece, published a well-nuanced novel about lesbian affections in England in the 1930s, written in reaction against what she called the, quote, needless bellyaching and fuss, unquote, of Radcliffe Hall, didn't accompany her impressive later portrayals of male homosexuality in the circle around Socrates and the court of Alexander the Great with anything comparable about women. The only gesture in that direction that I can remember from her work comes in The King Must Die, 1958. The Latin teacher I mentioned earlier lent me a copy, and on the Texas Gulf Coast, what we call the Gulf of Mexico, it was an eye-opener. When the young and, quote, highly sexed, that's Renault's term, Theseus, sent to Crete as a bull dancer, takes in the pleasures open to those facing what is usually certain death in the arena. It is different for the two sexes. And I'm quoting from Renault's novel, in Theseus's voice. For the men, there were always ways into the palace precincts, all of them winked at. I learned one need never be short of a woman in the labyrinth, unquote. The female bull dancers, however, quote, were locked in at night and watched all day, unquote, since pregnancy would make them unfit for their job. Accordingly, quote, they made do with one another, so old a custom that no one questioned it, unquote. The flat offhandedness of that tolerance has an attractive real-world feel to it, and very likely would have been the case in some contexts, though unfortunately it wouldn't apply to the circumstances of Sappho's poems. Their very existence testifies to love's wish to be heard and stake its claims. By the time we can actually document the performance of that wish, we're in Athens in the 5th century BC, and the main context is one of the dominant institutions of classical Greek culture as it comes down to us, the all-male drinking party, or symposium is the more dignified term, for which Sappho's poems regularly provided part of the entertainment. We have trouble believing, and I think rightly, that this was the case 2 centuries earlier off the coast of Asia, and scholars have worked hard to reconstruct how it was then for surely, and again I don't disagree, a primarily female audience. Speculation here has worked in something close to a void as far as direct evidence is concerned, though. In 1897, Ulrich von Wilhelmovitz-Mellendorf, the commanding figure of Germany's great age of Altertumswissenschaft, wrote of Sappho as the leader of a female theosos, a religious company devoted to worshiping a god, in this case Aphrodite, through singing and dancing. The suggestion, as they say, had legs, and the term shows up in a remarkably wide range of treatments of Sappho, taking on the look of some kind of scholarly consensus. Bruno Gentili's account of Sappho in his Poetry and its Public in Ancient Greece, an excellent discussion that in many ways comes close to what I will be having to say about her, deploys that term repeatedly as if there were nothing problematic about it. But that is not the case, as alert scholars have noted from the start, and as Holt Parker summarized, perhaps more mercilessly than he needed to, in an article in 1993, and quoting Parker, the word is never used anywhere in any of the poems of Sappho or Alcaeus, nor is it ever used anywhere in any ancient source about her. Its only purpose, whether conscious or not, is to lend a spurious air of antiquity to a modern creation. I am officially announcing its death, unquote. He's probably having more fun than he really should have. But despite the scholarly relish for fighting over it, terminology is not itself the problem. Scholars more cautious on that score are fully capable of being more reckless on others. Claude Calam, in his Choruses of Young Women in Ancient Greece, takes note of the dubiousness of theosos and carefully works his way around some other words that have been used, school, cult, circle, group, for, quoting, what an association of women at the end of the 7th century would be. The scrupulous phrasing is characteristic. But this caution about labels is the lead-in to one of the most arrestingly speculative theories anyone has come up with. Sappho's group in Calam's telling would be a select core of girls on their way to womanhood and almost certainly marriage, some of whom would be picked out for what Calam calls initiatory sexual experiences with the woman in charge, in which the rest would participate collectively and vicariously by being trained in choral singing that celebrated the exalted, if necessarily transient love of the chosen ones. Part of the allure of this picture is indeed the exotic strangeness of it, like something reported by an anthropologist whose credulity could perhaps stand looking into. though Kalam is relying not on field notes and local informants, but on a cat's cradle linking numerous scattered bits of evidence, mostly from elsewhere and later in classical Greece. Kalam's exposition gets progressively more confident as he goes on, but the highly conjectural character of what he proposes becomes more and more obvious, with layers of conjecture built on conjecture which can almost certainly never be confirmed, and on which, this I think is the real test, you would hesitate before trying to situate any load-bearing structure of your own. Not that I wouldn't like to see what a good novelist or filmmaker might do with the conceit. If you ask me, Michelle Yeoh would be electrifying as Sappho, but that's something different. My own historical intuition, or at least literary historical intuition, about the ambiance within which Sappho composed her poetry, is that it was much like that around Socrates in Athens some centuries later, that an ad hoc, informal, same-sex grouping with little or no official structure, but circumscribed and energized by a strong sense of exclusivity and shared interests, both abstract and practical, within which interpersonal bonds could quickly become volatile and intense. Bloomsbury would be a co-ed variant. There would be much talk of beauty, or at least what in classical Greek is called habrotes, elegance, in East Aeolic abrosuna, a grade below, perhaps, tokalon, the beautiful, but still a tensely elite standard. Multiple love objects would be the norm. Who is at this time Sappho? I'm quoting from one of her poems that you'll be hearing again before I'm through, but no less all-consuming for being so. The pairing of Socrates and Sappho in this regard is, once you think of it, an obvious one. Maximus of Tyre made it in the 2nd century AD, with a drumbeat of quotations from Sappho to drive his point home. Maximus was himself an avoid Platonist, but part of his agenda was to bring the hagiography of Socrates a bit down to earth. Now, quoting Maximus, speaking of Socrates, how his heart pounded and his body broke out in a sweat over Charmides, how he was terrified and raved like a bacchant over Alcibiades. The canonical picture of the Socratic circle in Plato's Symposium explicitly posits an idealized transcendence of physical desire as the ultimate and most prestigious goal. But the talk around the room has buzzed all evening with a strong sexual hum, a term I take from the late Eve Sedgwick. Her coinage homosocial would also apply. The uninvited presence of an aroused Alcibiades on towards dawn only brings that hum to full audibility. Alcibiades holds the company and literally millennia of readers spellbound with his account of how he almost had sex with Socrates. That account becomes the famous dialogue's final word on love. In such an environment, a strict celibacy could actually be the expression of disabling erotic obsession, though it would not be the only such expression, and certainly not the most likely. Analogies like that only work if you don't push them farther than they want to go. And I will not be going much further with this one, which, among other things, takes no notice whatsoever of the gender difference. Indeed, that is, if you will, my methodology insofar as I have one, turning back from possible tangents. I want to have as little as possible to do with efforts at reconstructing what, however capriciously, history has seen fit to edit out of what we actually know about Sappho and her poetry, since such reconstructing tends to build up its own momentum and can easily distract us from what's visible and vital in the words we have. The reason, of course, we are having this conversation is that the scraps that we have do bear the impress of a collective context for the narratives that, with varying degrees of specificity, we inevitably intuit in them. Maximus tells us that Sappho calls love muthoplochos, a weaver of tales. With appropriate patience and tact, we can tease out some of the emotional contours, if not the details, of love stories that not uncommonly involve more than just two people. Franco Ferrari is particularly deft at this. We would be fooling ourselves to think anyone could be wholly rigorous about constraining speculation to our pitiful body of textual evidence, but I would like to come as close as I can, getting at the huge and possibly unique discrepancy between the meager nature of Sappho's remains and the immensity of her influence requires dealing directly and intently with the Sapphic fragments as they have presented themselves since their Renaissance retrieval, dispersed unpredictably and with a seeming irrationality across the terrain of Western literature. That dispersal, however arbitrary it may seem or be, is also an opportunity if we're appropriately curious about what happens when those fragments, to those fragments after they land. What comes out of them has the potential to tell us something about what went into them. Think of them as the Sibyl's scattered leaves, or to use a phrase from one of the last century's best mystery writers, seed on the wind. But it's time for an example. Oh, it works. I take my first one from arguably the most distinguished of my predecessors in giving these lectures, T.S. Eliot, who slipped in an allusion to Sappho, almost a quotation, at an important crossroads in The Wasteland, 1922. A quick, unscientific survey of literate people of my acquaintance who have reason to think that they know that poem well, reveal that few of them, none actually, remembered such an allusion, though they instantly recall the passage in which it occurs. Everyone does. The violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits like a taxi throbbing, waiting. I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, can see at the violet hour, the evening hour that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from sea, the typist home at tea time. Eliot's own offhanded note seems to assume, 100 years ago, he may have been right, that his reader will catch the reference. Quote, "This may not appear as exact as Sappho's lines, but I had in mind the longshore or dory fisherman who returns at nightfall." He means Sappho fragment 104a. Hesperus, bringing everything that shining dawn scattered. You bring the sheep, you bring the goat, you bring back the child to its mother. These two lines are quoted with a gap in the first line in a Greek treatise on literary style attributed to Demetrius of Phalerum, an Athenian orator from the 3rd century BC, but apparently written in Roman times, possibly by Plutarch's friend Demetrius of Tarsus, quoted as a particularly fetching example of anaphora, repetition. The treatise was first printed by the Aldine Press in 1508 and was widely used in Renaissance universities. The quotation was extracted and the missing words filled in from other sources by Fulvio Orsini for his edition of the collected Sappho in 1568, and from there passed into general currency. I will be discussing Orsini and his predecessor, Henri Etienne, in more detail in my third lecture. In its afterlife, the couplet is valued for its gentle intimation of all now being well. Lord Byron expanded it into a stanza of English ottava rima and inserted it into the third canto of Don Juan, 1821, to just this end. O Hesperus, thou bringest all good things, home to the weary, to the hungry cheer, to the young bird, the parent's brooding wings, the welcome stall to the o'er-labored steer. Whate'er of peace about our hearthstone clings, whate'er our household gods protective dear, are gathered round us by thy look of rest. Thou bringst the child, too, to the mother's breast. The evening star provides a needed uplift after a lengthy digression, and digression is Byron's own word for it, on the sad state of contemporary poetry in both Greece and England. Burning Sappho, that's Byron's phrase, is remembered near the start of it, though not specifically named in connection with the address to Hesperus. A later lord, Alfred Tennyson, for whom Sappho's lines seem to have been a kind of talisman, similarly did not think his readers needed their author identified to receive their reassuring message. And quoting Tennyson, Hesper whom the poet, yes. Oh, missed one, sorry. Well, this is Tennyson. Hesper, whom the poet called the bringer of all good things. All good things may move in Hesper, perfect people's perfect things. From Locksley Hall, 60 years after, 1887. In Eliot's memory, Sappho's anaphora assimilates imagery from some famous lines from Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson's Requiem, home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill, 1890, to Sappho's immediate poetic occasion, the onset of evening. Sappho's second line, which is responsible for the quotation's preservation, is metrically problematic and often marked by editors as corrupt. David Campbell is not alone in thinking it, quote, damaged beyond repair, unquote. The force of the repetition that Demetrius, whoever praises, is, however, clear enough. Daytime is a time of estrangement, while evening is a time when things return to where they belong. Strong parallels with the wedding poem by Catullus, who admired Sappho and imitated her even more closely elsewhere, suggest that the Sapphic fragment comes from one of the epithalamia that apparently filled an entire book of her Hellenistic editions. Within one of those poems, this appeal to the evening star would serve the comforting purpose of casting the wedding, which would mark a major change in the course of two lives, as actually a return, a homecoming, as the bridegroom takes the bride to the place they will now live. This is now home. A.E. Housman shows how this might look by incorporating an expansed translation of Sappho's couplet into his full-scale classicizing epithalamium, published, as luck would have it, in the same year as The Wasteland. Oh, thank you. No. I knew I would mess this up. Yeah, okay, thanks. Happy bridegroom, Hesper brings all desired and timely things. All whom morning sends to roam, Hesper loves to lead them home. Home return who him behold, child to mother, sheep to fold, bird to nest from wandering wide. Happy bridegroom, seek your bride. Houseman reportedly composed his epithalamium for the wedding of Moses Jackson, the young man of whom he was long and unavailingly enamored, giving his poem a further resonance that I will not be exploring here. Even without following up on that, though, I am myself, of course, flirting with the kind of reconstruction of context that I said I would like to get away from. Well, and in any case, the reconstruction here is quite plausible. That is, that it's connected with epithalamium. Reconstruction here is quite plausible and also hard to resist as a counterpoint to what is going on when Eliot calls evening twice the violet hour. Le bleu, as my colleague Claire Kenny reminds me it is called. Putting it that way directs attention not to the fading of the light, though by tea time in the unreal city in the winter darkness will already be there, but to the advent of a new and different color, the violet, a transformative mood with a dire power all its own. It is also, by what anyone familiar with Eliot's ways would think carefully before calling it coincidence, a color with a long-standing association with Sappho. Violets are among the love tokens that show up in Sappho's poems. And we several times hear of figures in violet robes, clearly a mark of distinction. A surviving line of poetry by somebody else addresses Sappho herself as violet-haired, Ioplaka. An adjective Pindar will use of muses. The author of that line is usually thought to be her fellow lesbian poet Alcaeus, and he would certainly have been in a position to know what her hair looked like. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the sapphic connotations of both the flower and the color become broader and more emphatic and provocative to the point of scandal. A potboiler published in Boston, of all places, in 1894 advertised itself with the title Violet, the American Sappho, a realistic novel of Bohemia. And its title gives a good idea of what its readership was expecting to take for granted, and they would not be disappointed. When Oiné Vivienne, born Pauline Mary Tarn, an English poet who wrote in French, including translations of Sappho, made a public statement by attempting suicide in 1908 over her unsatisfied love for a woman named Violet, she was found lying on her divan with a bouquet of violets placed over her heart. After she died a year later, her posthumous poems were published as Dans un coin de violette. It is as though when Sappho enters the unreal city, the message of homecoming that her words promise becomes troubled and ominous. The hermaphroditic Tiresias, whom Eliot identifies in his notes as, quote, the most important personage in the poem, uniting all the rest, unquote, has just had to field a veiled solicitation from a Levantine merchant in London on business, and is now constrained to witness heterosexual love as the modern world knows it, between the emotionally numbed typist and the grimly irresistible young man carbuncular, probably from somewhere up north, one of the low on whom assurance sits like a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. As elsewhere in Eliot's poems from the 1920s, such as Sweeney Among the Nightingales, headed with an epigraph from Aeschylus, the classical allusion measures what has gone sour as Western civilization has worked out its enervating destiny. Well, some evenings go better than others. Christopher Ricks and Jim McHugh, in their note to this passage in Eliot's poem, locate it in a long-running succession of poetic evenings, recurring moments when the toil of daily life turns a corner into something different. The plowman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. That's Gray, of course, elegy written in a country churchyard. Chronologically, Sappho's fragment is the earliest of these, and as far as we can tell, initiates the topic's history for European poetry. Gray's poem is the canonical representative of one branch of that history, where the receding of the day's business clears space for solitary meditation. The famous first stanza finds its way gently to the word me, from which the rest of the poem unfolds. Evening, though, can throb with something else, a promise or threat of what can manifest itself as the lights go down. The Wasteland offers one version of that. There's another in Paradise Lost. Now came still evening on, and twilight gray had in her somber livery all things clad. Silence accompanied for beast and bird, they to the grassy couch, these to the nest were slunk, all but the wakeful nightingale. She all night long her amorous descant sung. Silence was pleased, now glowed the firmament with living sapphires. Hesperus that led the starry host rode brightest, till the moon, rising in clouded majesty, at length apparent queen unveiled her peerless light, and o'er the dark her silver mantle drew. Evening is here a solemn processional, led, as in Sappho, by Hesperus. Other small touches connect the two evenings. The star's effacement by the even lovelier moon is there in another of Sappho's fragments, 34, preserved by Eustathius in commenting on the Iliad. The Emperor Julian, apparently thinking of the same poem, fondly remembers her calling the moon Agrea, silvery. The singing of the nightingale is also in Sappho's repertoire. Milton, almost as an afterthought, includes violets among the flowers used to line the bed towards which his procession leads. It is not, that's a little after the quote I give here. It is not exactly a bridal bed. The man and woman who lie down in it are doing so not for the first time. They had, in fact, been remembering that first time, quoting Eve, "Thy gentle hand seized mine, I yielded," unquote, but not nostalgically, since the import of the whole episode is that, blessedly for them, every time is the first time. They are, of course, Adam and Eve, still in Eden. And Milton is making one of the bolder moves in his long deliberated epic, imagining unfallen sexual love. To quote the paraphrase William Kerrigan and I offered some years back, quote, "A naked man and woman arise in the morning, intermix the duties of the day with flirtatious venery, then consummate their love at night with a real capture, a real yielding, and go to sleep. This is paradise," unquote. We are given to understand it more or less happens like that every day. First-time readers can still be surprised to realize that for Milton, sexual intercourse was not the fall. My students regularly are astonished at that. Not the fall, despite its reputation since then and the role it may indeed have played in individual human lives. Milton goes out of his way to be clear how things were between our shameless first parents before everything went wrong. and then the next quotation there, handed they went, and eased the putting off these troublesome disguises which we wear. Straight side by side were laid, nor turned, I ween, Adam from his fair spouse, nor Eve the rites mysterious of connubial love refused. And Milton pauses to denounce in his own voice those who would have it otherwise. Whatever hypocrites austerely talk of purity and place and innocence, defaming as impure what God declares pure and commands to some, leaves free to all. Our Maker bids increase, who bids abstain, but our destroyer, foe to God and man. Both poet and reader know it is not to last. Satan is already within the bounds of Eden, and in the sleep about to come, he will enter Eve's dreams. But for now, the epithalamium keeps its promise. Eliot and Milton offer two almost directly contrasting examples surrounding the same topos. The great diaspora of Sappho's once substantial body of work is, I'm arguing, the sum of such examples, an undirected wafting of bits of, as it were, her lyric DNA into whatever soil turns out to be ready for them. That metaphor is the main thesis of what I have to say here. Cumulatively, these bits do their part to shape our inherited consciousness of how desire goes about its business, and to enable a kind of lyric shorthand for recognizing it. An enigmatic turn at the end of a poem in John Ashbery's Some Trees, 1956, does not need to say more than it does. And just reading the second stanza there. A fine rain anoints the canal machinery. This is perhaps a day of general honesty without example in the world's history, though the fumes are not of singular authority and indeed are dry as poverty. Terrific units are on an old man in the blue shadow of some paint cans, as laughing cadets say, in the evening, everything has a schedule if you can find out what it is. As it happens, the first poem in Ashbery's first book. Scattered, hesitant portents of something mysterious and singular about to be revealed, Ashbery will become famous for those, are gathered up in the mutually supportive laughter of those cadets on the town, looking for the heart of Saturday night. Alert with confidence in the possibilities of the evening ahead, they are almost sure of their ability to master those possibilities when they come along. No evening star there. Light pollution can make it hard to spot in the modern city. And no authorial endnote sending you to Sappho, but I hope I have shown that the allure of evening and its playbook is worth seeing as a continuity, and that Sappho is worth thinking of in its present. That is about as aggressive as I think I need to make it. The continuity in question is not, as I understand it, of some intimidating tradition to whose challenge later participants do, or more likely do not, rise. I was a graduate student at Yale when Harold Bloom first lectured on the anxiety of influence, and I was holding my head in my hands the whole time. But of possibilities suggested and opportunities opened up for making it new, and that is not the last time the ghost of Ezra Pound will be called forth here. What I have to say will be embedded in a lot of textual detail of Sappho's own surviving fragments, with all the uncertainties that still cling to them, of what testimony we have that is in one way or another connected with their survival. There's a fair amount of it, and I've found it surprisingly absorbing, even when it now comes across as ignorant and obtuse, done with them. The picture that I hope results is one in which both the original and its imitations stand forth more clearly in their particularity, even as they are illuminated and indeed dignified by the transaction. That may sound a little mystifying, but, well, see what you think.